The prairie lay quiet beneath a copper sky, the kind of evening that made the horizon blur and the air taste of dust. Evelyn Hart stood alone beside a station that no longer belonged to time. The roof sagged, the sign leaned, and the track ran east into nothing. She'd come too far to turn back. Her gloved fingers held the corner of a letter that had already worn through its folds. The words promised a husband, a home, a patch of land near Willow Creek where wildflowers once grew. She had believed in those words more than she'd believed in herself. Hours passed. No train. The wind played with her skirt and the ribbon on her bonnet, and she wondered if she had been foolish to trust paper and ink. The world had a way of teaching her that dreams were often written by liars. When the sun dipped low, she heard the slow, measured rhythm of a horse on hard ground. She turned toward it, half afraid, half hopeful. A man rode out of the heat haze, tall in the saddle, coat dark against the light. He stopped a few feet from her, the animal snorting softly, the man's face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. She could feel the weight of his gaze before she saw his eyes. Grey, steady, tired. The kind of eyes that had seen too much of everything. He looked toward the rails that vanished into the horizon and told her there hadn't been a train through Willow Creek for nearly 2 years. The words struck her, harder than the wind. She almost laughed at the cruelty of it. She had traded everything she had for a promise built on ashes. He studied her quietly, then stepped down, lifting her trunk as if it weighed nothing. His voice was calm, almost reluctant, when he offered her shelter at his ranch until she could decide what to do next. Something in his tone made her believe he didn't invite strangers often. Maybe never. She followed because there was nowhere else to go. The sky behind them burned red as they rode, 2 silhouettes swallowed by the open land. The Mercer place stood at the end of a long trail, framed by the skeletons of dead wheat. The house looked worn but still upright, the windows glowing faintly from a single lamp inside. A dog barked once and went silent again. He led the horse to the corral, unhitched her trunk, and motioned toward the porch. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A simple table, a small fire, a silence that felt like it had been there for years. He poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Grateful for the warmth, even though it wasn't tea, he asked where she had come from. She told him about the farm that had drowned in rain back east, about the letter from a man named Ezra Cole, about how she had boarded a train toward a dream. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said he remembered Ezra Cole. The man had tried to build a mill near the river and vanished after the flood. No one had heard from him since. The sound of it hollowed the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the cup, watching the water tremble with the beat of her heart. He leaned against the hearth, the light catching the lines along his jaw. "You can stay here for a while," he said. "Work if you want." "The place needs tending." She nodded, the words barely forming. Gratitude, embarrassment, disbelief, all tangled together. That night he showed her to a small room at the back of the house. The window faced the fields where the wind moved like a tide over dust. On the bedside table lay a cracked vase with one dry stem inside. When he left, she sat on the bed and opened her satchel. At the bottom lay a small pouch of sunflower seeds she'd carried from her father's farm. She poured them into her palm, running her thumb over their smooth shapes. They looked like hope, tiny and impossible. She whispered that maybe they'd still grow here. From somewhere outside came the low sound of a horse shifting in the stall, and a man's voice, soft and low, calming it. The tone reached her before the words did, gentle, patient, the sound of someone who once knew how to love but forgot the way. She lay down without undressing, staring through the window at the sky full of indifferent stars. The house creaked with wind. In that silence she felt the strange comfort of being in a place that wasn't hers, but didn't push her away. She thought about the man with the grey eyes and the weary voice, and wondered what kind of ghosts lived inside him. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely invisible. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of dry earth and something faintly sweet. Like memory, she closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. Somewhere beyond the hills, morning would come, and with it the question of whether she would stay. Morning came pale and cold, spilling light across the floorboards like a thin promise. Evelyn rose before the rooster called, her hands stiff from the chill and her thoughts scattered like seed in wind. The house was still. Somewhere beyond the doorway, She heard the steady sound of metal against stone. Luke sharpening a blade, maybe. Or working before dawn like a man who didn't know rest. She pulled her shawl close and stepped outside. The air bit against her skin, clean and raw, smelling of pine and horse sweat. Luke stood by the fence line, sleeves rolled, the rhythm of his movements deliberate, controlled. There was something in that steadiness that calmed her, even as it made her chest tighten. He turned when he sensed her there, his eyes as grey as the early sky. She thanked him for the room, for the water, for not asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. He nodded once and told her breakfast was inside. A single word reply, but his voice held the warmth of someone who meant it. Inside the kitchen, she found bread baked sometime in the night and a pot of coffee left on the stove. She sat at the rough wooden table and listened to the silence breathing around her. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was older, settled, like the land itself. Days passed that way. She mended what she could, cleaned, cooked and watered the stubborn patch of earth behind the house where she'd planted the sunflower seeds. Luke never asked her to do any of it, but he didn't stop her either. He worked from dawn to dusk fixing fences, tending the cattle that had survived the drought, and repairing the barn roof where the wind had torn it open. At first, they spoke little. But silence had its own kind of language. The way he'd leave a can of nails by the door because he noticed she'd been fixing the loose boards. The way she'd pour 2 cups of coffee instead of 1 without needing Gus, to ask if he'd want some. There was something in the rhythm of those small kindnesses that felt like a heartbeat beneath the quiet. One evening, after a long day of heat and dust, she found him sitting on the porch, staring into the fields. The horizon burned gold, and the light cut across his face in a way that softened the sharp lines time had carved. She brought him a glass of water. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for only a second, but in that second something shifted. The air between them grew still, and the faint sound of cicadas faded behind the rush of their shared silence. He asked about her father's farm, not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to know. She told him about the summers when the fields looked like oceans of gold, and her mother's laughter drifted through open windows. She spoke of loss, like it was a wound that no longer bled but still hurt when touched. Luke listened, eyes distant, as if her words were pulling something buried inside him back to life. When she finished, he said the drought had taken his wife and child 6 years ago. Fever came first, then fire. He hadn't left the land since. The words fell between them heavy as rain that wouldn't come. Evelyn's throat tightened, but she didn't reach for him. She just sat there, letting the quiet hold them both. When he finally looked at her, his gaze was raw, unguarded. "I buried the roses she planted," he said softly. "Nothing's grown there since." Evelyn turned toward the field she'd sown with sunflowers. "Maybe it will again," she murmured, though part of her wasn't sure if she meant the land or his heart. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the windows, whispering like it carried old secrets. She rose and went outside barefoot in the dust. The moon hung low, turning everything silver. The sunflower patch was still bare, just mounds of earth waiting to bloom. Behind her she heard the creak of the porch and knew without turning that Luke had followed. He didn't speak, didn't ask why she was standing there in the cold. He just stepped close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the space between them. They stood there together, the night stretching around them like an unspoken confession. For the first time since she'd arrived, Evelyn felt something break open, not pain, not quite hope, but the faint pulse of something alive. She thought of the seeds under the dirt, quiet, unseen, waiting for a season that might never come. Yet she believed they would bloom, because believing was all she had left. When she finally turned to go back inside, Luke's eyes followed her, steady, unreadable, but softer than before. The next morning the sky opened. Rain fell in slow, trembling drops, soaking the dry ground until the scent of earth rose thick and sweet. Evelyn stood at the window watching it, her heart heavy and light at once. Out in the field, Luke walked through the downpour, his hat low, his steps sure. When he passed the patch where she'd planted her sunflowers, he paused, and for a long moment simply stood there, head bowed, letting the rain wash him clean. She didn't know it then, but something had already begun to change in both of them. Not fast, not loud, just steady, like roots deepening in wet soil. And for the first time since her journey began, Evelyn Hart felt she might finally be home. Days folded softly into weeks, and the rhythm of life at the Mercer ranch began to find its quiet pulse again. The fields, once grey and thirsty, turned the colour of honey under the early sun. The scent of wet soil and new grass lingered long after the storm. Evelyn worked barefoot through the mornings, the hem of her dress catching dew, her hands deep in the tender soil she'd coaxed to life. The first sunflower sprouted on a Thursday, small, stubborn, defiant. She found it at dawn, its stem trembling in the breeze, the green just beginning to twist upward toward light. It felt like a promise whispered from the earth itself. Luke noticed too. He didn't say much, only stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes narrowed against the sunlight. But the corner of his mouth lifted in something that looked like almost smiling, and that small flicker of warmth was enough to keep her heart glowing for the rest of the day. Every evening, she caught him watching from the porch as she watered the seedlings. Sometimes he'd bring her a lantern when the light grew dim, holding it out without words, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Each touch was fleeting, but it left something behind, the kind of heat that lingered, even after distance returned. There were nights when Evelyn would wake to the sound of the wind dragging across the roof, and she'd hear him walking the halls restless. Once she caught sight of him standing by the open door, staring out into the black horizon, as if waiting for something, or someone, to come back. His past lived in his silence, but she had learned not to pry. Some hearts were stitched too roughly to be pulled open too soon. Still, there were hints. A stranger rode through town one afternoon, a man in a dark coat, his eyes sharp and searching. The blacksmith mentioned later that he'd asked questions about Luke Mercer, about a fire, about a debt unpaid. When Evelyn heard, something cold fluttered through her chest. She didn't tell Luke what she'd learned. She only watched him closer that night, noticing the way his hands trembled slightly as he cut wood for the fire. As summer deepened, the sunflowers grew tall and wild, bright faces turning toward the sky. The field had become something beautiful, almost defiant against the memories buried beneath it. Evelyn began to laugh again, not loudly but easily, the sound of someone remembering how. And Luke, though still wrapped in his quiet, began to meet her laughter halfway. One evening they rode out together to check the far pasture. The air shimmered with heat, the sky streaked orange and violet. Evelyn's hair came loose from its braid, strands catching the light like threads of gold. Luke glanced her way more than once, each time trying not to be caught. When they reached the fence line, she dismounted, kneeling by a broken post. He crouched beside her, close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his body. The scent of dust and pine clung to him, and for a moment she forgot the world beyond the quiet hum of their breathing. Her hand brushed his as they both reached for the same nail. The contact was brief, but something passed between them, an invisible current that made the air tremble. She looked up and found his gaze waiting. There was no hesitation there anymore, no guarded distance, just raw, unspoken longing. The moment stretched, until a gunshot shattered the silence. It came from somewhere beyond the trees. The horses reared, the birds scattered, and Luke moved instinctively, pulling her behind him. His eyes darkened, and in that instant she saw something in him she hadn't before. Fear, not for himself, but for her. He told her to get back to the house. She started to protest, but the sound of another shot echoed, closer this time. He was already in the saddle, jaw set, the softness she knew replaced by something cold and sharp. Evelyn watched as he rode toward the trees, dust rising behind him like smoke. The fields around her fell into a heavy silence. She waited until night fell, the lantern burning low on the porch, her hands clenched tight around its handle. Hours passed before she heard the slow tread of hooves. Luke returned, hat pulled low, his sleeve torn, blood streaked along his arm. Evelyn ran to him, breath breaking. He didn't speak as she led him inside, helped him wash the wound. It was shallow, he said, a warning, not an attack. When she pressed him for more, his gaze drifted to the fire. There were men, he told her, from before. A land dispute. A debt that had ended in fire and death. He thought it was over. He thought they'd stopped hunting ghosts. Evelyn's voice was steady when she asked if they'd come back. He didn't answer, and in his silence, she found her answer. Later, when he fell asleep in the chair by the hearth, she stood watching him, the lamplight tracing the scars on his hands. She thought of all the things he carried and how love, for some people, was not a gift but a risk. Outside, the sunflowers swayed in the dark. Golden faces turned toward the moon, as if reaching for light even when there was none. Evelyn understood that kind of reaching, the desperate hope that something broken might still grow again. And though the night stretched long and full of danger, she whispered into the quiet, promising herself she wouldn't run, not this time. The days that followed the gunfire settled into a fragile calm, the kind that felt borrowed rather than earned. Luke said little about what had happened, but the shadow of it lingered behind every word, every silence. Evelyn sensed it in the way his eyes tracked the tree line, how his hand rested a little too close to the rifle by the door. Still, the ranch went on. The cattle needed tending, the fences mending. The world didn't pause for fear. Evelyn worked beside him, though he told her she didn't have to. She wanted to. The labor steadied her, gave her something solid to hold while the unease curled inside her chest. And when she caught him watching her across the field, the faint trace of admiration softening his guarded face, it steadied him too. The sunflowers had bloomed wide now. Their faces turned bright and proud toward the sky. They filled the field with gold, an ocean of color that caught the light and shimmered like hope made real. Sometimes she'd see Luke standing there at dusk, staring into the yellow sea as if it were something he'd lost and somehow found again. But hope has a way of drawing trouble close. One evening, a storm rolled over the prairie, dark and heavy. The sky split open in flashes and rain fell like iron. Luke was out checking the cattle before it hit. Evelyn waited by the window, her heart beating too fast. When she saw two riders appear in the distance, moving fast through the rain, her breath caught. They weren't Luke. The men came straight for the house, their faces blurred by the downpour, but the intent in their movement was unmistakable. Evelyn grabbed the lantern, her mind racing. The rifle rested by the door where Luke always kept it. Her hands shook as she lifted it. She'd never fired one before. They didn't knock. The first man burst through, mud on his boots, gun drawn. His voice was rough, shouting for Luke Mercer. The second man followed, scanning the room. Evelyn stood frozen, her back to the wall, the lantern flame flickering between them. One of them sneered when he saw her. "You're the girl!" Her pulse thundered. She raised the rifle, and too high, too slow. The man stepped closer, grinning through rainwater. "He's not worth dying for." Before she could answer, the sound of hooves cut through the storm. Luke's voice rang out hard and sharp, ordering them away. The men turned toward the sound just as Luke appeared in the doorway, soaked to the bone, gun steady in his hand. The moment hung in the air like the breath before thunder. Luke told them to leave. They laughed. One raised his weapon, and everything broke loose. The gunfire tore through the room. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Evelyn dropped to the floor, the lantern crashing beside her, spilling fire across the boards. Smoke rose fast, thick and choking. She crawled toward Luke's voice, the heat searing her lungs. When she reached him, he was bleeding, shoulder torn open. She dragged him toward the back door as flames climbed the walls. The men were gone, maybe driven out, maybe burned away. She didn't look back. Outside, rain fought the fire in bursts, steam curling into the night. The house crackled, groaned, then roared as the roof gave way. Luke tried to stand, but the pain bent him to his knees. Evelyn held him there in the mud, her arms tight around him. "It's over," she whispered, though she didn't know if it was true. His head rested against her shoulder, breath shallow. "I told you. Trouble follows me." Her tears mixed with the rain. "Then I'll follow you too." For a long while neither spoke. The fire burned itself out behind them, leaving only the smell of smoke and sunflowers crushed beneath the storm. When dawn came, the house was nothing but blackened beams and ashes. Yet in the distance the sunflower field still stood, battered but alive, faces tilted stubbornly toward the rising light. Luke watched them from where he sat, arm bound, skin pale beneath the bruises. "You should go," he said quietly. "This place has taken enough from you." Evelyn knelt before him, her voice steady despite the ache in it. "You don't understand. I didn't come here to find a home. I came here to find something worth staying for." His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw the walls fall away. The man beneath the scars, beneath the silence. The one who still believed in love even if it had nearly destroyed him once. He reached for her hand, fingers trembling. You don't owe me this. Maybe not, she said softly, but I want to. The prairie stretched endless around them, the wind carrying smoke and promise. Behind them the ashes smouldered. Before them the sunflowers glowed gold against the ruin. Sometimes, Evelyn thought, the heart blooms best in the places that have burned. Summer bled slowly into autumn, painting the prairie in gold and rust. The fire had taken the house, but not the land, not the stubborn green that kept pushing through charred soil. Out where the earth had burned black, shoots of sunflower began again, small and defiant, like tiny suns refusing to die. Evelyn and Luke built a shelter first, 4 walls of rough timber, a roof that leaked when the rain came too hard. They worked side by side, his arms still bound, her palms blistered and raw. Sometimes she'd laugh when a board slipped or a nail bent, and the sound would stop him mid-swing. He'd stare for a heartbeat, as if that laughter were the first light he'd seen in years. The nights were cold, but the space between them wasn't. They shared coffee by the fire pit, talked about crops and fences and the price of cattle. And then, sometimes when the wind softened, they spoke of harder things. The wife he'd lost, the years he'd spent alone, the train that never came for her. The words didn't erase the pain, but they made it less lonely. By the first frost, the field had turned into a miracle. Hundreds of sunflowers, taller than a man, waving beneath the pale sky. Evelyn stood among them one morning, the light catching her hair, the petals brushing her hands. Luke watched from the porch, chest tight with something that felt like reverence. He walked out to her, boots brushing the damp soil. She turned when she heard him, smiling that quiet, certain smile that always undid him. He reached out and she stepped into his arms without a word. For a long time they simply stood there, the flowers swaying around them, the air smelling of earth and memory. He told her the ranch could never be what it was, but it could be something new. She told him she didn't want what was, she wanted what could be. That winter was kind. Snow drifted over the fields, softening the black scars. Inside the new house, warmth grew, not from the fire, but from the simple comfort of 2 people who had stopped running from their own ghosts. The men who had brought fire and bullets never returned. Maybe the land swallowed them. Maybe redemption had its own way of balancing the books. Luke never spoke of them again, and Evelyn never asked. The past had already burned. What mattered was the light that followed. On the first spring morning he found her out in the field again, wearing the same straw hat she'd arrived in, the brim frayed, the ribbon faded. She was cutting sunflowers, gathering them into a bundle so large it nearly hid her face. When she saw him watching, she laughed, that bright, startled laugh that still caught him off guard. He walked toward her, and she pressed one of the blooms into his hand. The petals were warm from the sun. "For the table," she said, though they both knew it was more than that. That night, as the lantern light flickered over the walls they'd built, Luke set the flower in a glass jar at the center of the table. He reached across the rough wood and took her hand. The gesture was simple, unspoken, final in its promise. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of sunflowers and rain. Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since either of them could remember, there was no weight between them, only stillness, only peace. Years later, people passing through Willow Creek would slow their horses to look at the Mercer place. The wide field of sunflowers glowing against the horizon, the whitewashed house standing quiet among them. They'd talk about how the land had burned once, how nothing was supposed to grow again, but it had, because sometimes love doesn't come like thunder or fire. Sometimes it comes like sunlight after smoke, gentle, steady, strong enough to make something bloom where nothing should have lived at all. And when they spoke of the woman who'd brought the sunflowers back, they called her what Luke always did when he looked at her with that small, amazed smile, the sunflower bride.